$20 for you, Mom." That was my son's final offer, his voice just dripping with the satisfaction of a man about to inherit his father's $45 million fortune. He wanted me at the will reading, not as a grieving wife, but as a witness to his triumph, to see the truth of my utter worthlessness sealed by my husband's final will. What he didn't know was that the father he idolized, even from the grave, had one last play to make, and the truth about me was the ace up his sleeve that would upend his entire game. I'm Susan Miller, a 6-year-old widow living a quiet life in Sausalito, and this is the story of how my late husband's will exposed a 20-year-long lie, forcing our arrogant son to face the truth that the mother he despised was the silent savior of our entire family. If this story touches your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to listen to more meaningful life stories with us. Your support is our biggest motivation to keep sharing. My son, Scott, thought today was his coronation. He believed his father, Richard, the man he worshipped like a saint, would pass him the scepter of the Miller Properties empire from beyond the grave. And he wanted me, the mother he saw as a stain on his father's perfect legacy, to have a front-row seat to my own failure and irrelevance. He wanted me there to breathe in the air of his victory, to feel the full weight of my own insignificance as the crown was placed upon his head. He had no idea that the father he idolized was a master storyteller, and his final act was written to deliver justice, not a kingdom. The call came at 8:15 in the morning. I was sitting by the window of my small Sausalito apartment, nursing a cup of Earl Grey tea that had gone a little cool. The morning fog still clung to the water, obscuring the sharp peaks of the skyscrapers across the bay, turning my son's city into a distant mirage. This was my world now. Quiet, simple, and buffered by a safe distance from the chaos of Miller Properties. For the past 20 years, I had learned to find peace in being invisible. I'd become an expert in existing without truly being seen, an art I was forced to perfect. The phone on the table buzzed, shattering the stillness. The sound was jarring, an intrusion from the world I had tried so hard to leave behind. The screen lit up with a single name: Scott. No heart emoji, no affectionate nickname, just the name, as bare and cold as our relationship. I hadn't saved his number the way a mother normally would, because he hadn't called me like a son in years. Every call was a transaction, a demand, or a notification. Never a "how are you?" I let it ring a few more times, taking a deep breath, steeling myself with an invisible armor. Finally, I swiped the screen and pressed the phone to my ear. "Mom, it's me." His voice came through, no greeting, just impatience. It sounded like a man checking an item off a to-do list. "Hello, Scott," I replied, keeping my own voice perfectly even, betraying no emotion. That was the first rule in my survival game with him. Never let him see he'd gotten to you. "Dad's lawyer, Mr. Davies, needs you here." He got straight to the point. 10 a.m. at the main office. The will is being read. A long pause stretched between us. I looked out the window, where the fog was beginning to burn off, revealing the stark tower of Miller Properties, a monument of glass and steel that I knew down to its bones. I was there when it was just a sketch on a dinner napkin. I had argued with Richard over the design of the lobby. I'd chosen every carpet, every piece of art for the walls. That place had once been a part of me, before it became the symbol of my exile. "I don't think that's necessary, Scott," I said softly. "Your father's legacy is for you. Everyone knows that. There's no reason for me to be there." A short, dry chuckle came from the other end, not a laugh of amusement, but a quick, clipped sound of condescension and pity. "It's a legal formality, Mom," he explained, as if to a child. "Besides, I think Dad would have wanted you there, to see his company placed in hands that can grow it, to see his legacy secured." The cruelty in his words was subtle. He didn't directly call me a failure, but the implication was perfectly clear. He was saying my presence was required not as a loved one, but as a witness to my own incompetence and his superiority. I stayed silent, letting his poison wash over me. Sensing my silence as submission, he decided to deliver the final blow, a petty little jab that encapsulated the entire nature of our relationship. "Don't worry about a ride," he added, his tone shifting to a nauseatingly false generosity. "I'll have my assistant Chad give you $20 for a cab home." Consider it me taking care of you one last time before things officially change. $20. The number drilled into my ear. The world around me seemed to fade, and I was pulled back into a memory I had tried to bury for 23 years. Scott was 20 then, an ambitious, self-satisfied sophomore at Stanford. I, at the time, was struggling. It was the early days of the crisis, before everything fell apart completely. Richard and I were fighting constantly over his risky investments. Money was alarmingly tight, but we were trying to shield Scott from it, not wanting to disrupt his studies. One day, he called, demanding money for a business club trip to New York. It was a lot of money. I had to sell my mother's pearl necklace, my only piece of valuable jewelry, to get the cash. I drove 2 hours down to Palo Alto to give it to him. I met him outside the campus library, and when I handed him the envelope of cash, I could see the embarrassment and irritation in his eyes. He didn't thank me. Instead, he looked at me, at my old car, at my simple clothes, and then he pulled out his wallet. He fished out a crumpled $20 bill and tossed it into my lap. "Here, for gas," he said, his voice cold. "And next time, don't come to campus looking like that. My friends don't need to see how pathetic my mother is." That $20 bill felt like a burning coal in my palm. I cried the entire way home, not because of the money, but because of the cruelty from the son I loved so dearly. And now, 23 years later, he was using that same number to humiliate me all over again. He had probably forgotten, but I hadn't. I never forgot. Scars like that never truly fade. "All right, Scott," I finally said, my voice so calm it surprised even me. "I'll be there." I hung up before he could say another word. I sat motionless for a long time, the tea in my hands now completely cold. I didn't feel anger. That emotion had been worn down long ago. Instead, I felt a profound weariness and an infinite sadness for Richard. He had loved our son so much. He had sacrificed everything for him, and in return, he had created a man who was incapable of feeling another's pain. I stood up, walked into my bedroom, and opened the closet. I pushed past the simple, comfortable clothes I wore every day and found it, tucked away in the very back, protected in a plastic garment bag, a navy blue power suit. I hadn't worn it in 20 years. It was the suit I wore the day I signed the legal documents that officially removed my name from all executive functions at Miller Properties. It was the day I agreed to become the ghost, the failed wife who couldn't keep up with her genius husband, all to cover up the horrifying truth of the company's crisis. I wore this suit when I signed my own disappearance into existence. Today, I would wear it again. Not as a victim, but as a witness. I was going, not to see my son crowned, but to see my husband's final act play out. Richard was a meticulous man. He never did anything without a reason, and if he required my presence, there had to be a damn good reason. The taxi ride across the Golden Gate Bridge felt like a journey through time. I had the driver take the scenic route through the Presidio, an old habit from the days when we first moved to the city. Richard and I used to spend hours walking here, dreaming about the future, hand in hand, looking at the fledgling skyscrapers rising in the distance. They were just naked steel frames back then, but in his eyes, they were already castles. He had a gift, an ability to see potential where others only saw chaos. I wondered if he ever looked at Scott and saw the potential buried beneath his arrogance, or if he only saw a project that had strayed tragically from its original blueprint. When the cab pulled up to the Miller Properties building, a doorman in a crisp uniform rushed to open my door. He was young, probably half my age, and looked at me with polite curiosity. He didn't recognize me. To him, I was just an older woman in a simple suit, here for some meeting. 20 years is a long time. Long enough for a face that once graced business magazines to become a total stranger on the very doorstep of the empire I helped build. The feeling of being invisible in the one place I should have belonged no longer pained me. It was simply a fact, like the gray of a San Francisco sky on an autumn morning. I stepped into the lobby, and a blast of cold, conditioned air enveloped me. Everything was gleaming and silent. The Italian marble floors reflected the recessed ceiling lights like a still, black lake. The walls were paneled in expensive ebony wood, and the air carried the faint scent of leather and money. I remembered fighting with Richard over this lobby. He wanted it to be monumental, a statement of power. I had wanted it to be warmer, more welcoming. He won, in the end. Looking back, maybe that was a sign of things to come. The company became a cold monument instead of a warm home. The private executive elevator whisked me to the top floor in near total silence. When the stainless steel doors opened, I was faced with a painfully familiar space. Richard's office, now Scott's, was at the end of the hall, with the double oak doors I had chosen. Next to it was the boardroom, where my sentence was about to be read. Mr. Davies's secretary, a woman my age, with her silver hair in a neat bun, greeted me with a respectful nod. She was one of the few who remained from Richard's time. "Mrs. Miller," she said quietly, "they're waiting for you." Her eyes held a silent sympathy, as if she knew far more than she let on. I took a deep breath and pushed open the heavy door. The room was exactly as I remembered. A long, mirror-polished mahogany conference table, large enough to seat 20, dominated the space. High-backed black leather chairs were arranged in perfect order, and at the far end of the room, a wall of glass, stretching from floor to ceiling, offered a breathtaking panorama of the city and the bay. It was a view designed to make anyone who entered feel small and overwhelmed, a view of power, and at the center of that power stood my son. Scott was standing with his back to the door, hands clasped behind him, looking out the window like an emperor surveying his domain. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit that accentuated the physique he meticulously maintained with gym hours and calorie-controlled meals. Everything about him screamed control and precision. Beside him, perched in one of the leather chairs, was Chad. The young assistant was swiping furiously at a tablet, but I knew he wasn't really working. He was sensing the atmosphere, ready to act on his master's every command. He was a remora fish, swimming in the wake of a shark, hoping for scraps from the kill. And in another corner, trying to catch the perfect light for a selfie against the glass, was Tiffany. She wore a tight, fire-engine red dress, a color far too loud for a somber Monday morning, but Tiffany was never concerned with appropriateness. She was only concerned with attention. My presence didn't seem to register with her at all. The sound of the door closing behind me made a soft click, but in the room's silence, it sounded like a gunshot. Scott turned around. When he saw me, a complex expression flickered across his face. There was a bit of annoyance, a dash of impatience, and an undisguised smugness. He was savoring this moment. He was playing the part of the dutiful son who had to endure the presence of his out-of-place mother for procedural reasons. "Mother," he said, his tone flat, devoid of warmth. "You're on time." I didn't reply. I just looked at him, at the son I had carried and birthed, the boy who once had bright eyes and a wide smile, who was now a stranger with a heart encased in ice. His eyes flickered down to my navy blue suit. I saw the corner of his mouth twitch, a smirk so faint it was almost invisible to an outsider, but to me it was as clear as a shouted insult. He recognized the suit. He might not remember the exact date, but he knew it was from the before time, the era of my weakness and failure. Tiffany finally noticed I was there. She lowered her phone, her eyes raking over me from head to toe. Her gaze, already heavily painted with mascara and eyeshadow, was undisguisedly dismissive. It was the look a young, beautiful, and successful, or at least successfully attached woman, gives an older, unbranded, and expired one. She turned to Scott, leaned in close to his ear, and whispered something. I didn't have to hear the words to know what she said. She looked so out of place. Scott didn't answer her, but a slight frown creased the space between his brows. He hissed quietly, "Be quiet. It's just a formality." He said it just low enough for me not to hear, but not quite low enough. He wanted me to know my place, an inconvenient formality. In their eyes, I was a ghost, a relic of the past, a woman who couldn't keep up with her great husband and now existed only as an embarrassing reminder. They didn't know that this ghost had once walked through fire in the dark, shielding the saint they worshipped from a storm that would have drowned everything, including this very boardroom. I walked silently to the table. A place had been set for me, marked by a small card that read Mrs. Susan Miller. It was at the far end of the table, opposite the chairman's seat at the head, where Scott would undoubtedly sit. The placement, separate and distant, said it all. I was not part of the circle of power. I was an audience member. I pulled out the heavy chair and sat. The cold leather seeped through the fabric of my suit. I placed my small handbag on the floor and folded my hands on the polished surface. I could see my own faint reflection in the mahogany. A woman with silver-streaked hair, the lines around her eyes a map of anxious years, and a look of calm that had been forged in 2 decades of storms. Mr. Davies entered, followed by his secretary. He carried a thick leather briefcase, old but well-maintained, much like the man himself. He had been Richard's lawyer from the beginning, a man of integrity and discretion. He was one of the few people in the world who knew a piece of the truth. He gave Scott a professional nod. "Scott!" Then he turned to me. His eyes met mine and held them for a moment. There was no pity. There was no judgment. There was only a quiet acknowledgement, a deep, unspoken respect. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice low and warm, "thank you for coming." The difference in his greetings was subtle, but it was as clear as night and day. With Scott, it was a formality. With me, it was a welcome. Scott, of course, noticed. His annoyance deepened. He wasn't used to not being the center of attention and reverence in any room. "Can we get started, Davies?" he said, his tone sharp. "I have a lunch meeting at the Battery." He made a point of dropping the name of the exclusive club, a way of reasserting his status, of reminding everyone that his world was still turning, and he had no time for sentimentality. Mr. Davies didn't reply immediately. He walked calmly to the head of the table, placed his briefcase down, and clicked it open. He removed a thick stack of documents, bound with a dark blue ribbon. He untied the ribbon slowly, deliberately. Every motion he made carried a sense of ceremony, as if he were preparing for a sacred rite. "Of course, Scott," he finally said, his eyes meeting my son's. "Let us begin. The last will and testament of Richard Miller." He cleared his throat. The room fell silent, the only sound the soft hum of the ventilation system. Mr. Davies put on a pair of thin, gold-rimmed reading glasses, a ritualistic gesture that transformed him from a family acquaintance into an officer of the law, a messenger from the other side. He placed his hands on the document, his long fingers brushing the first page as if it were an ancient text. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with anticipation, or in my case, a calculated patience. I knew Richard. He never got straight to the point. He was an architect not just of buildings, but of narratives. He always started by laying a foundation before putting up the walls. "I, Richard Miller, Mr. Mill." Davies began to read, his voice resonant and clear, filling the room's silence. "Being of sound mind and, well, not so sound body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all prior wills and codicils." A faint flicker of humor. That was Richard's voice. Even facing his own mortality, he couldn't resist a bit of dry wit. Scott wasn't amused. He shifted in his seat, an impatient gesture that betrayed his eagerness to skip the preamble and get to the main event. His part. "First," Mr. Davies continued, "I direct that all my just debts and funeral expenses be paid in full. I trust my son, Scott, will not choose the most expensive casket just for show. I'm just a skeleton. I don't need hand-polished mahogany." Chad let out a little snort of a laugh, then quickly stifled it when he caught Scott's cold glare. Tiffany, busy editing a photo, didn't even register the jab. I, however, felt a sad smile flicker in my mind. That was Richard, worried about Scott's ostentatiousness, even in death. "Second, I will begin with a few small bequests to people who have left a mark on my life and on the heart of my wife, Susan," he read on. At the mention of my name, I felt a sharp, dagger-like glance from Scott. He didn't like this. In his world, I was to have no role in his father's will, other than that of a silent spectator. "I leave the sum of $25,000 to Mr. Isao Tanaka," Mr. Davies said. The name caught me by surprise. Mr. Tanaka was our Japanese gardener from years ago, a small, quiet man with skillful hands and a wise soul. He had retired and moved to San Diego more than a decade ago. Scott frowned. Tanaka? The gardener? Why? He muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. Mr. Davies continued reading as if he hadn't heard. Mr. Tanaka did more than tend our garden. He taught my wife, Susan, how to cultivate and care for the peace rose bushes she so loved. He spent patient hours showing her how to prune, how to fertilize, how to protect them from pests. I often watched them from my study window, two quiet people tending to beauty together. Susan once told me that those roses were a reminder that the most beautiful and enduring things often require silent care and unnoticed sacrifice. Richard's words were like a honey-tipped arrow, flying across the room and piercing my heart. I lowered my head, looking at my folded hands, trying to hide the wave of emotion that washed over me. Mr. Tanaka. The peace roses. That had been my small world during the darkest years, a tiny sanctuary from the storms raging within the company and within my own home. Richard had noticed. In the midst of the stressful meetings, the endless business trips, and the crushing pressure, he had seen me in the garden, and he had understood. Scott did not. I could feel his irritation radiating across the table. To him, this was just meaningless sentimentality, a waste of time and money on a long-forgotten employee. He couldn't see the hidden message, the note Richard was sending to me, and the first gentle rebuke to him. Next, Mr. Davies said, turning a page. I leave the sum of $50,000 to the Bay Area Women's Startup Fund. This time, Scott didn't just frown. He let out an audible huff of contempt. Good Lord, he whispered to Chad. Did my father become a social justice warrior in his final days? But Mr. Davies wasn't finished with Richard's explanation. I make this donation in honor of the most intelligent, courageous, and business-savvy person I have ever known. The person without whom Miller Properties would simply not exist. The person who was the true architect behind my greatest successes, my wife, Susan Miller. The room fell completely silent. I lifted my head, my heart pounding. Those words, spoken aloud, in this room, in front of my son, it felt like rain after a 20-year drought. Richard had never said those words when he was alive, not after the crisis hit. His shame and his cowardice had prevented him. But now, from the grave, he was shouting the truth. I glanced at Scott. His face had hardened into a stone mask. The smugness was gone, replaced by a look of utter confusion and a simmering anger. He looked at me. His eyes narrowed, as if trying to solve an irritating puzzle. He didn't understand. He couldn't reconcile the failed mother he'd constructed in his head with the architect of success his father had just described. The contradiction was short-circuiting his simple worldview. Chad looked bewildered. He glanced from Scott to me, then back down at his tablet, as if the answer might be there. Tiffany, for the first time, had put her phone down. She was looking at me with a new curiosity. For the first time, in her eyes, I wasn't just a boring old woman. I had become a mystery. Is everything all right, Scott? Mr. Davies asked, lowering his glasses slightly to look directly at my son. The concern in his voice was tinged with theatricality. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was the conductor of this orchestra, and he was savoring every note. Fine, Scott said through gritted teeth. Just a bit of sentimental fluff. Please, continue. With pleasure, Mr. Davies replied, putting his glasses back on. Scott's irritation was like a charged cloud in the room, heavy and threatening to burst. He'd stopped trying to hide his impatience. His fingers tapped a silent, furious rhythm on the polished mahogany. Every small gift, every word of praise for me, was a personal insult to him, a deviation from the script written in his head, a script in which he was the sole star, the undisputed heir to a king. Mr. Davies seemed not to notice or deliberately ignored the rising tension. He turned to a new section of the will with an almost cruel placidity. He cleared his throat, a small sound that had the effect of pulling everyone's attention back to him, back to Richard's final words. And now, Mr. Davies declared, his tone shifting, becoming more formal. We come to the primary matter of this will, that which pertains to the core assets, the very heart of all that Richard Miller built. Instantly, the atmosphere changed. Scott stopped tapping. He sat up straighter, his body leaning forward slightly. The annoyance on his face was replaced by a look of intense focus, a raw and naked hunger. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Chad, too, held his breath, his beady eyes gleaming with the reflected light of millions of dollars. Even Tiffany sensed the gravity of the moment. She put her phone away in her purse, her eyes wide with anticipation. I, on the other hand, felt a chill run down my spine. I knew Richard. I knew how he told a story. He had just finished the prelude. Now was the time for the plot twist, the turn designed to catch the audience completely off guard. As for the entirety of my remaining estate, Mr. Davies read, his voice slow and deliberate, enunciating every word, including, but not limited to, the entire controlling interest of Miller Properties, all subsidiary corporations, all commercial and residential real estate holdings, the stock portfolio, and all other tangible and intangible assets associated with the company, having a total estimated value at this time of $45 million. He paused intentionally, letting the immense figure hang in the air. $45 million, a number that could change lives, reshape futures, buy power. Scott was barely breathing. His lips were slightly parted, and I could see an almost painful tension in his jaw. And then, Mr. Davies read the next sentence. I hereby leave in its entirety to my only son, Scott Miller. A soft whoosh of air escaped Scott's lungs. It was so audible it was almost a groan. All the tension in his body seemed to melt away in an instant. He leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, magisterial movement. His shoulders slumped, and a smile, not a smirk, but a true, broad, and undisguised smile of victory spread across his face. He had won. All the doubts, all the earlier annoyance were wiped away. His father, in the end, had done the right thing. The king had officially passed the kingdom to the prince. Chad was the first to react. Congratulations, Scott, he said, his voice thick with admiration and sycophancy. Congratulations, sir, absolutely deserved. Tiffany let out a little squeal and reached across the table to grab Scott's hand. Oh, baby, she cooed. This is incredible. You own this city. Scott accepted the accolades as his rightful due. He gave Tiffany's hand a light squeeze, but his eyes weren't on her. His eyes were on me. He looked directly at me from the other end of the long table. That look was a complex cocktail of many things. There was triumph. There was pity. There was a touch of contempt, and there was an unspoken question. See? His eyes said. See, Mom? Dad always knew who was worthy. All that sentimental talk before was just for show. This is the truth. I am the chosen one, and you are nothing. I met his gaze without flinching. I kept my face a complete blank, a still mirror that refused to reflect his triumph back at him. My placidity seemed to confuse him. He expected a reaction. A flicker of jealousy, perhaps. A touch of sadness, or at the very least, an admission of defeat. But I gave him nothing. I simply observed, like a scientist watching an experiment reach its expected conclusion. In my head, I was speaking to Richard. Clever, my love, I thought. You gave him the cheese. Fat, fragrant, and irresistible. You let him taste the victory, let him believe he was safe, that the trap had been disarmed. He never thought to check for the steel jaws waiting just beneath, the ones that were about to snap shut with terrifying force. Of course, Scott said, his tone now back to its usual confident, even arrogant self. He was speaking to the room, but the words were clearly meant for me. This was the only logical outcome. I've spent my entire life preparing for this. Dad knew I was the only one who could take the company to the next level. He began to talk about his plans, about expanding into the Asian market, about restructuring certain divisions. He spoke as if the will reading was over, as if Mr. Davies were now merely a scribe for his grand pronouncements. Chad listened with a look of pure adoration, nodding vigorously every so often. Tiffany had her phone out again, probably drafting a social media post to announce her boyfriend's newfound wealth. Scott was on top of the world. He had received the ultimate validation from the father he idolized. He had proven to the mother he scorned that she was wrong. He had his kingdom. He was standing on the highest pedestal, built of arrogance and lies. And he had no idea that Richard, the master architect, had designed a ticking time bomb right into its foundation. Scott was in the middle of his impromptu victory speech about the glorious future of Miller Properties. He was drunk on his newly conferred power, his voice echoing in the boardroom as if he were addressing thousands of shareholders. Chad nodded along, a sycophant in perfect rhythm, while Tiffany was smiling at her phone screen, likely reading the first comments on her boastful post. To them, it was a done deal. The battle was over, the spoils divided. I looked at Mr. Davies. The old lawyer sat silently, his hands resting on the will, patiently waiting for Scott's monologue to pass. His expression was utterly placid, like a cliff face against crashing waves. He was in no hurry. He knew that what he was about to say would silence Scott's plans more cruelly and effectively than any interruption could. Finally, Scott paused for a breath, ending his speech with a dramatic wave toward the window. "The future is here," he declared, "and it starts right n." "Pardon the interruption, Scott." Mr. Davies's voice cut through the air. It wasn't loud, but it had a weight that punctured Scott's bubble of self-congratulation. My son turned, an annoyed frown creasing his face. "What is it, Davies? I thought we were finished here. You can send the rest of the paperwork to my office." "I've got a busy day ahead," he said, "my office," with a special emphasis, as if to remind everyone of his new status. Mr. Davies didn't flinch. He slowly held up a single hand. "Not quite finished. There are a few minor details. An addendum, in fact." The word addendum hung in the air. It sounded harmless, a boring legal term, but the way Mr. Davies said it, with a quiet gravity, told me this was it. This was the first tick of the time bomb. Scott let out a huff. An addendum? About what? Mother's jewelry or Dad's old golf clubs? He tried to sound dismissive, but I could see a tiny flicker of anxiety in his eyes. He hated deviations from the plan. Mr. Davies turned to the very last page of the main document, where a single, different-looking sheet of paper was attached. "This is Clause 8B, he said, his tone perfectly professional. "It pertains to the transfer of control of the company." "Transfer of control?" Scott repeated, the irritation in his voice growing. "You just read that. It all comes to me." "It does," Mr. Davies agreed calmly, "but with a single prerequisite. A condition that must be met before the transfer becomes fully, legally binding." Silence fell over the room once more, but this time it wasn't the silence of anticipation, but of confusion. Chad stopped taking notes. Tiffany looked up from her phone, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "What condition?" Scott demanded, his voice losing its confident edge, becoming sharp and defensive. Mr. Davies looked down at the paper, reading the words carefully, as if to ensure not a single nuance was missed. "And I quote," he said, "This transfer of control of Miller Properties, however, shall only become fully and irrevocably effective once the heir, Scott Miller, has successfully and completely resolved a pre-existing contractual obligation with a former partner known as Sovereign Trident Capital, relating to a development project from the year 2005 entitled Ocean's Breath." He finished reading and looked up, meeting Scott's gaze directly over the rims of his glasses. Scott blinked, then a short, strained laugh escaped his lips. "Sovereign Trident? Ocean's Breath? What the hell are you talking about, Davies?" "I've never heard of a company called Sovereign Trident. And the Ocean's Breath project, that was a mess from 20 years ago. Some resort in Mexico Dad had to scrap. I remember some minor lawsuits, but he settled all that ages ago." He said it with a confidence that was already starting to fray at the edges, as if he were trying to convince himself more than anyone else in the room. The memory of that project was clearly a bad one. It was the project that had started the downward spiral. I, however, remembered it perfectly. Ocean's Breath. The name was poetic, but it was the beginning of our nightmare. It was the project Richard had sunk millions into, based on the promises of unreliable partners. It was the project that pushed us to the brink of ruin. "Your father settled the civil suits," Mr. Davies confirmed calmly, "but this is not a lawsuit. It is a contractual obligation." "What contract?" Scott snapped, his confusion rapidly turning to anger. "The company has thousands of contracts. Why would he single one out from 2 decades ago as a condition of his will? This is absurd." "I cannot comment on Richard's motives," Mr. Davies replied, his tone remaining perfectly neutral. "I can only execute what is written here. And what is written is that, until the matter with Sovereign Trident Capital is resolved, your control over the company is, legally speaking, temporary and conditional. Temporary? Scott almost shouted the word. It was a slap in the face. What does that even mean? It means, Mr. Davies explained patiently, that until such time, the designated executor of the will, in this case, myself, representing this law firm, retains final oversight on all major financial decisions of the company. The first part of the trap had sprung. Scott was stunned. The kingdom he had just been granted minutes ago suddenly had a gatekeeper, and that gatekeeper wasn't him. His father, from the grave, had placed an invisible leash around his neck. He could sit on the throne, but he couldn't truly rule. His face went from red to pale. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a wild, helpless anger. He looked at me, as if this were somehow my fault, as if I had conspired with Richard to orchestrate this farce. "This is a joke," he whispered, his voice trembling. "This has to be some kind of sick joke." But looking at the grim face of Mr. Davies, and the heavy silence in the room, he knew it was no joke. The time bomb wasn't just ticking, it had started to smoke, and Scott was tied to it. Scott's rage was a caged animal. He paced the short distance between the table and the glass wall, his hands clenched into fists. His confidence had shattered, leaving a confused and betrayed man, not by an enemy, but by the very father he worshipped. Tiffany and Chad sat like statues, too terrified to say anything that might draw his wrath. They were merely spectators in a tragedy they didn't understand and wanted no part of. "It's not possible," Scott repeated like a mantra, his voice hoarse with fury. "My father was meticulous. He never left loose ends. There has to be a mistake. Check your records, Davies. That name, Sovereign Trident, it's not even in our vendor database." I checked. He had pulled out his phone and been searching frantically for the past few minutes, a desperate attempt to find a logical error, a crack in this nightmare. Mr. Davies remained unmoved. He waited for Scott's outburst to exhaust itself, letting the silence return to swallow his angry words. Only when Scott stopped, breathing heavily, did he slowly reach down and open his leather briefcase once more. This time, he didn't pull out a standard document. What he placed on the table made a soft, heavy thud. It was a thick, dark blue leather-bound file, completely different from the will. It had no title on the cover, only a single, unbroken, crimson wax seal bearing the personal signet of Richard Miller. "This is no mistake, Scott," Mr. Davies said, his tone losing its neutrality and taking on a graver note. "And Sovereign Trident Capital was not a vendor. They are not in the company database because your father did everything in his power to ensure no official record of their existence ever touched Miller Properties." Scott stared at the sealed file as if it were a venomous snake. Then, "What is that?" he asked, his voice losing its edge, replaced by a trembling apprehension. "This," Mr. Davies said, placing a finger on the wax seal, "is the original file for the Ocean's Breath project. The entire file. The parts your father never entered into the official company books. He gave it to me nearly 20 years ago with explicit instructions that it was only to be opened upon his death, and only if certain conditions in his will were met." He produced a small, silver-handled letter opener from his pocket. With a single, precise movement, he sliced through the brittle wax. The small crack of the breaking seal sounded like a bone snapping in the silent room. He opened the file. Inside were not neat, printed pages. It was a chaotic collection of old documents, yellowed contracts, copies of bank statements from Swiss and Cayman accounts, faded faxes, and pages of handwritten notes in Richard's strong, decisive script. 20 years ago, Mr. Davies began to narrate, his voice as steady as a historian's, Miller Properties was on the verge of bankruptcy. The Ocean's Breath project, a gamble on which your father had staked everything, had collapsed due to local government corruption and fraudulent partners in Mexico. The banks were calling in their loans, and investors were threatening to sue your father for fraud. Scott listened, his face ashen. He knew part of this story, the sanitized version, the one about a heroic father who single-handedly saved the company from the ashes. "Your father was desperate," Mr. Davies continued. "And then an offer came, not from a bank, not from a Wall Street investment fund. It came from Sovereign Trident Capital." Mr. Davies slid a contract out from the file. He pushed it across the table toward Scott. This was not a bailout loan, Scott. It was a capital partnership agreement. I could see the dense legal language on the page from across the table. Scott leaned over it, his eyes scanning the lines. They offered to inject $20 million in cash into the company, immediately. Mr. Davies explained. Enough to pay off the banks, enough to placate the investors, enough to save Miller Properties. So what? Scott looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. It was a smart business deal. He did what he had to do. Read Clause 4C, Mr. Davies said calmly. Scott's eyes went back to the page. I saw his shoulders tense. In exchange for that investment, Mr. Davies said, verbalizing it for him, Miller Properties agreed, in the future, to facilitate Sovereign Trident's capital restructuring activities through our international construction projects. Capital restructuring is a very elegant term, Scott. He paused, letting Scott connect the dots himself. What does it mean? Tiffany suddenly blurted out, her vapid voice breaking the tension. What does that mean? This time, Scott didn't tell her to be quiet. He was waiting for the answer too, though it was clear a part of him already knew, and was horrified. Mr. Davies looked directly at Scott. It means money laundering, Scott. Plain and simple. Sovereign Trident is not an investment fund. They are a front for an organized crime syndicate. They gave your father dirty money, and in return, our company would clean it through massively inflated construction contracts overseas. Scott's entire world collapsed in that moment. I could see it in his eyes. The image of the great father, the business hero, the titan of integrity, it all shattered into a million pieces. My father? He stammered, unable to form a sentence. No, it's not possible. My father would never. He was the most honorable man I knew. Your father was cornered, Mr. Davies said, a hint of sympathy in his voice. He had a choice between losing the company and going to prison for fraud or making a deal with the devil. He chose the devil. And the outstanding obligation, Scott whispered, his voice barely audible. Precisely, Mr. Davies confirmed. The contract stipulated that the deal would only truly conclude after one final capital rotation was performed, one worth $10 million. Your father managed to put it off for 2 decades, finding excuse after excuse, but his death triggered the final clause. The new heir is responsible for completing the deal. The trap was now fully revealed. It wasn't a leash, it was a yoke. Richard hadn't just given Scott a company, he had given him a crime in progress. Scott wasn't the heir to an empire. He was the successor to a criminal conspiracy. He would either have to become a criminal himself, completing the money laundering deal, to keep the company, or he would have to refuse, and likely face the wrath of a dangerous criminal organization and the total collapse of Miller Properties when the secret came out. His kingdom had become his prison. The revelation acted like a silent bomb in the room. It left no loud explosion, only the deadly, radioactive fallout of disillusionment. Scott slumped into his chair, his body looking as if it had no bones. He stared at the contract on the table, but I knew he wasn't reading the words anymore. He was staring at the wreckage of the idol he had spent his life worshipping. Chad looked physically ill. He seemed to shrink in his seat, as if trying to become invisible to the awful truth. Tiffany was simply frozen, her pretty face a mask of complete incomprehension, unable to process a reality more complex than the price of a handbag. Why? Scott finally spoke, a whispered question to the empty air. Why would he do this? Why leave this mess for me? This isn't a legacy, it's a curse. Mr. Davies looked at him with an almost pitying gaze. That's a good question, Scott, he said softly, and I believe your father left an answer. Mr. Davies pulled another envelope from the blue leather file. This one was different. It was made of Richard's heavy, cream-colored personal stationery, and it was sealed not with wax, but simply taped shut. On the front, in Richard's familiar handwriting, were the words, "For my son, Scott," to be read only after everything else. Your father wrote this in his final week, Mr. Davies explained. He wanted you to know the whole story, not the version he let the world see, but the real, unvarnished truth. He offered the letter to Scott, but my son just looked at it, his hands trembling too much to take it, as if he feared the words inside would burn him. You read it, Davies, Scott said, his voice raspy. I can't. Mr. Davies nodded. He carefully opened the envelope, removed 2 handwritten pages, and began to read. His voice became the vessel for my husband's final confession, and every word was a hammer blow to the foundation of lies we had lived on for 20 years. "Scott, my son," Mr. Davies read, "if you are hearing these words, it means I failed to find the courage to tell you the truth while I was alive. Cowardice, I suppose, is a hard habit to break. You have spent your life looking at me as a hero, a titan of industry. I let you believe in that myth, because it was easier than letting you see the real man behind it. A man who made mistakes, a man who panicked, and a man who was saved by someone much stronger than himself." Scott closed his eyes, as if he couldn't bear to face what was coming. "The truth of the crisis 20 years ago was worse than you know," the letter continued. "I had driven the company to the absolute brink of ruin. It wasn't just bad business decisions. It was arrogance. I refused to listen to warnings. I believed I was infallible, and when reality came crashing down, I fell apart with it. I sat in this office, the very one you're in now, and I was ready to lose it all. The company, our home, and your respect. I panicked. I was ready to give up. But your mother, Susan, she was not." At the mention of my name, Scott's eyes snapped open. A deep confusion washed over his face. This story was taking a turn he could never have imagined. "While I was drowning in self-pity, your mother took action," Mr. Davies read on, Richard's voice echoing from the past. "She stayed up night after night, going over every number, looking for a way out, any way out, and she found one, not Sovereign Trident. Their offer came later. Your mother found a legitimate but difficult path. A complex restructuring plan that would have required us to sell off a significant part of the company, to downsize, and most importantly, to publicly admit my failure. I refused. My pride wouldn't let me. I couldn't stand the thought of telling the world that Richard Miller had failed. And that's when the offer from Sovereign Trident appeared, like a sweet poison. It promised an easy way out, a way to cover my mistakes, to save the empire and my image. I was seduced by it. But your mother was not. She saw them for what they were. She warned me. She begged me not to go down that road. "It will destroy us, Richard," she said. "It will plant a poison in the soul of this company." But I wouldn't listen. I was blinded by fear and pride. I decided I would sign the deal. The letter paused, as if Richard were gathering his strength for the hardest part. "And that is when your mother did something extraordinary. Seeing she couldn't stop me, she decided to control the damage. She knew that if the names Richard Miller and Miller Properties were tied to a deal like this, it would be the end. Sooner or later, the truth would come out. So she made a decision that saved me, saved the company, and saved you. She told me, 'All right, if you have to do this, then I will do it. Your name will not be on any of the paperwork. I will be the one who deals with them.' It was her, Scott. It was your mother who stepped in. She created shell corporations under her maiden name. She was the one who flew to Zurich to meet with those people. She was the one who signed the dirty contracts. She deliberately built a legal firewall between me and the crime, taking all of the risk onto herself. And the price for that? The price was that she had to disappear. To protect me, she had to agree to the story that she simply couldn't handle the pressure, that she had withdrawn from the company. I let her take that shame. I let the world, and worst of all, I let my own son, believe that his mother was weak, that she had quit. The woman you've scorned for 20 years, the woman you saw as a failure, was our family's savior, Scott. She sacrificed her reputation, her career, and her relationship with you, all so that I, a proud and cowardly man, could continue to play the hero in your eyes. The silence in the room after those final words were read was absolute and suffocating. It was no longer the silence of confusion, but the silence of an undeniable truth that had destroyed everything. Scott sat motionless, his face as white as the paper Mr. Davies held. Tears began to well up in his eyes, not tears of sadness, but of profound shock and shame. He slowly turned his head, and for the first time in 20 years, he truly looked at me. In his eyes, I no longer saw contempt or pity. I saw a bottomless confusion, the horror of realizing that his entire life, his entire belief system, had been built on a lie. And the person he had treated like dirt was the one who had quietly cleaned up the mess so he would have a clear path to walk. The confession had been made. The truth was out. And now, Richard's true legacy, a tangled mess of guilt, sacrifice, and one last chance for redemption, was placed squarely on our son's shoulders. Scott's world had been reduced to ash, and in the silence that followed, the only sounds were his own quiet, hitching breaths and the rustle of paper as Mr. Davies placed Richard's letter back in its envelope. The confession from the grave had done its work. It hadn't just destroyed a lie, it had destroyed a man, or rather the man Scott always thought he was. The arrogant prince was gone, leaving only a lost little boy who had just learned his castle was built on sand, and the woman he'd always seen as the Wicked Witch was in fact the queen who had secretly protected the realm. He was still looking at me, his eyes red-rimmed and wet. A silent conversation took place across the 20-year chasm between us. There was disbelief, there was shame, and there was a mute, pleading question. Is it true? He was begging me, with his eyes, to say it was all some cruel joke, one last lie from his father to punish him for some reason. I didn't give him that comfort. I just held his gaze, my expression calm but unyielding. My silence was the most painful confirmation of all. Yes, it's all true. Mr. Davies cleared his throat, pulling everyone's attention back to the cold reality of legal documents. The emotional drama was over. It was time for the consequences. Richard's letter, he said, his tone professional once more, brings us to the final provisions of his will. These provisions were written to reflect the truth that has just been revealed. He turned to a new page, one marked Final Addendum. To my beloved wife, Susan, Mr. Davies read, and at hearing my name first, I saw Scott flinch. To whom I owe a debt that can never be repaid, not just of money, but of honor and love. To begin to make amends for the years of silence and injustice she has endured. He paused, looking at me meaningfully. I leave her the entirety of my personal estate, he continued. This includes, but is not limited to, my life insurance policy, my entire personal portfolio of stocks and bonds, the villa in Lake Tahoe, and our art collection. The total value of these assets are to be combined into an irrevocable trust valued at $5 million. $5 million. The number was almost meaningless to me. It was just a figure on a page, but the meaning behind it was immense. Richard had made a clear distinction. This was his money, not the company's. It was the clean part of his fortune, untainted by the deal with Sovereign Trident. It was an act of penance, an attempt to give me a fresh start, completely independent of the toxic legacy of Miller Properties. But Richard wasn't done. In addition, Mr. Davies read on, and this is the most important part, I leave Susan something more valuable than money. Mr. Davies reached down, and this time, he pulled a small, polished wooden box from his briefcase. He opened the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of blue velvet, was a single, old-fashioned, safe deposit box key. This key opens a box at Wells Fargo Bank, Mr. Davies explained, his eyes still on the page. Inside that box, Richard has preserved all the original proof of your sacrifice, Mrs. Miller. Every contract you signed with Sovereign Trident under your maiden name, every wire transfer statement, every email and handwritten letter he ever wrote, begging for your help and promising to one day make it right. It is yours, to do with as you please. You can use it to publicly clear your name, or you can burn it and let the past lie. The choice is yours. I looked at the key. It was small, but it held the weight of 2 decades. It wasn't just proof, it was power. Richard wasn't just giving me money, he was giving me back control of my own narrative. He was giving me back my name. And then, Mr. Davies turned to Scott. My son sat there, shrunken, as if waiting for a final killing blow. He'd heard me receive $5 million, and the truth, he was probably expecting to be left with nothing. And finally, to my son, Scott Miller, Mr. Davies read, and I could hear the shift in his tone, a cold severity replacing the warmth he'd used for me. Scott looked up, his face a wreck of fear and one last, desperate flicker of hope. Because you have lived a life of luxury bought with your mother's sacrifice, and have benefited from a lie I was too cowardly to correct. Richard's letter continued, ruthless and unsparing. The legacy I leave you is not a gift, but a responsibility. You will retain control of Miller Properties. A tiny flicker of relief crossed Scott's face, but it was immediately extinguished by the next words. But you will not own it free and clear. You will be its custodian, but you will pay for your ignorance. I leave you the company, with all its troubles, including the obligation to deal with sovereign Trident capital. You will have to figure out on your own how to get out of the mess my pride created and your silence condoned. Your real legacy, Scott, is not $45 million. Your legacy is a chance at redemption, a chance to prove that you are more than the product of my lies and that you can be a better man than I ever was. And to help you on your way, Mr. Davies read, and this was the final twisting knife, I have one last gift for you. Mr. Davies reached into his briefcase one more time and pulled out a small envelope, identical to the one Richard had used for Scott's letter. He removed its contents. It was not a check. It was not a deed. It was a single bill. A crisp, new, $20 bill. Mr. Davies placed it on the table, directly in front of Scott, in exactly the same way Scott had once tossed a crumpled bill into my lap years ago. He read Richard's final note, written on a small slip of paper that came with it. Richard's voice, through the lawyer, was both sad and stern. I leave you this. It is the amount I saw you give your mother on the day you broke my heart. It is the only cash inheritance you truly deserve for your arrogance, until you learn the real value of sacrifice. Use it wisely. The scales of Richard Miller's justice had finally been balanced. He had given me freedom and clean money, and he had given our son a burden, a lesson, and a legacy worth exactly $20. The $20 bill lay on the mahogany table like a silent accusation. It wasn't just money. It was a mirror, reflecting back at Scott all his cruelty, his ingratitude, and his blind arrogance from the past 2 decades. It was the physical embodiment of his sin, priced with perfect, damning accuracy. For a long, endless moment, no one in the room moved. Scott stared at the bill, his eyes vacant. I could almost hear the gears in his mind grinding as he tried to process everything. His father's confession, my sacrifice, the cursed inheritance of Miller Properties, and now, this final, profound humiliation. The entire architecture of his reality had been pulverized, and he was left standing in the rubble with no idea what to believe or what to feel. Chad and Tiffany were the first to break the spell with action. They didn't say a word. They simply vanished. Like roaches when the lights are suddenly flipped on, their survival instincts took over. Chad was the more discreet. He slowly, quietly, packed up his tablet, sliding it carefully into his slim leather briefcase. He didn't look at Scott. He didn't look at me. He just looked at the floor, as if trying his best not to exist. He stood, pushed his chair neatly under the table, and with a barely perceptible nod in Mr. Davies's direction, he turned and walked swiftly from the room. No goodbye, no backward glance. The S. Miller, under its new captain, was clearly headed for an iceberg, and Chad, the clever rat, was the first one off the ship. Tiffany was more dramatic. Her silence lasted only a few seconds before it was broken by a contemptuous sniff. She looked at the still catatonic Scott, then at the $20 bill, and then a cold, practical realization dawned in her eyes. The man she had invested her time and effort into, her source for Birkin bags, Street, Bart's vacations, and the lavish life she craved, was no longer a golden goose. He was a Thanksgiving turkey about to be carved up. "You," she hissed, her voice low and venomous, all the fake sweetness gone. "You are pathetic." Those were the last words she said to him. She shot up from her chair, its legs scraping unpleasantly against the floor. She snatched her expensive handbag, the one probably paid for with sovereign Trident-tainted money, and stormed out of the room, her high heels clicking on the marble floor of the hallway like the hammer of a tiny executioner. The door slammed behind her, leaving a silence that was even heavier than before. In less than a minute, Scott's world had been stripped bare. His entourage was gone. The admiration had evaporated. All that was left was him, me, Mr. Davies, and an unbearable truth. Their departure seemed to be the final straw. It jolted Scott out of his stunned state, but not into clarity, into a primal rage. He looked up, and his face was no longer that of a shocked businessman, but of a cornered animal. His eyes were bloodshot, and a low, wordless growl escaped his throat. "No," he whispered, then repeated it louder. "No." His arm swept out in a violent arc, clearing the table. The crystal water glass, the pitcher, Mr. Davies's files, everything went flying. The sound of shattering glass against the picture window was a sharp, echoing crack. Water sprayed across the polished mahogany. "This is a trick!" he screamed, his voice breaking with rage and pain. Spittle flew from his lips. He was senile, confused, manipulated by her. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his face twisted with hate. "It was you. This was all you. You poisoned him against me." He turned on Mr. Davies, who sat silently, completely unfazed by the outburst. I'll sue you all. I'll prove this will is invalid. I will burn this all to the ground." But then, his rage focused back on the true target, the ultimate source of every failure in his life, as he saw it. It came back to me. "And you," he roared, "I will destroy you." He wasn't thinking anymore. He was just acting. He lunged toward me, knocking over his own chair. He wasn't a CEO. He was just a large, overgrown child in the middle of a tantrum fueled by years of insecurity and a mortally wounded pride. His hands were out, his fingers curled like claws, and his target was clearly my throat. I wasn't afraid. Strangely, in that moment, all I felt was a profound sadness. This was the ultimate legacy of Richard and me, a man so broken that violence was the only escape he could imagine. I braced for the impact, but it never came. Mr. Davies, the calm, elderly man, had moved with astonishing speed. His hand had pressed a small, hidden button beneath the lip of the conference table. Instantly, the boardroom doors flew open. Two large men in dark suits, the kind with discreet earpieces and the build of linebackers, entered the room quickly and silently. They were the building's security, but they had clearly been prepped by Mr. Davies. Before Scott could even make it halfway around the table, they had him. One on each arm. It was done with a brutal, practiced efficiency. Scott roared and struggled, but it was like a fish flailing in the nets of professional fishermen. It was useless. "Get your hands off me!" he screamed, his voice a mixture of fury and a new tinge of panic as he realized he had lost all control. "Do you know who I am?" Mr. Davies slowly rose to his feet. He surveyed the chaos in his room, the shattered glass, the spilled water, and the heir to the Miller Empire being restrained like a common thug. He didn't raise his voice. "Get him out of here," he commanded, his tone cold and final. The two guards began to drag Scott from the room. His expensive Italian shoes scuffed pathetically on the floor. "You can't do this to me," he yelled, craning his neck back to look at Mr. Davies. "I am Scott Miller. I own this building. I'll have all of you fired." They had him almost at the door. "Oh, and Scott," Mr. Davies added, his voice lethally calm. Scott stopped struggling for a second, looking at him with wild eyes. Mr. Davies pointed to the table. To the small, single bill, still sitting pristinely amidst the chaos. "Don't forget your inheritance." That was the killing blow. That one sentence shattered his last thread of control. He began to curse, a stream of filth and crazed threats. He cursed Mr. Davies, he cursed his father, but most of all, he cursed me. "I'll kill you, you old bitch! You hear me? I'll kill you!" He was still screaming it as they dragged him down the hall toward the elevators. His shouts grew fainter, then were cut off as the heavy oak doors swung shut, leaving a sudden, shocking silence in their wake. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, cutting off Scott's final scream and sealing his rage on the other side. Silence crashed down upon the room, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was thick and heavy, filled with the aftershock of violence and disillusionment. The magnificent boardroom now looked like a battlefield. Shards of broken glass glittered on the carpet like toxic diamonds, water pooled on the mahogany table, and an expensive leather chair lay on its side, defeated. In the midst of the wreckage, there were only three of us left: me, Mr. Davies, and the ghost of Richard Miller, who seemed to haunt every corner of the room. For a long time, Neither of us spoke. I just sat there, breathing slowly and evenly, letting the adrenaline that had surged through me begin to subside. Strangely, I felt no sense of triumph. No victory, just a vast emptiness, a deep sadness for all of us, for Richard and his cowardice, for Scott and his blindness, and for myself and my 20 years of silence. Mr. Davies was the first to move. He sighed, a breath of weariness, not annoyance. He calmly walked around the table, picking up the will that had been knocked to the floor. He gently brushed a few small shards of glass from its leather cover and placed it neatly back on the table. He was like a diligent butler, cleaning up after a scandalous party. "I apologize for that, Mrs. Miller," he said, his tone formal but sincere. Richard perhaps did not anticipate the volatility of Scott's reaction. "Perhaps he did," I replied, my voice raspy. It was the first thing I had said in what felt like a lifetime. Perhaps that's exactly what he wanted. Richard knew our son. He knew that beneath the polished veneer was an ego as fragile as glass, and today it had been shattered. Mr. Davies looked at me, a knowing look in his eyes. "Perhaps so," he conceded. I looked down at the table. Amidst the puddles and faint scratches, the $20 bill was still there, almost untouched. Next to it was the small wooden box containing the safe deposit key. My inheritance and my son's, sitting side by side, a stark contrast of truth and humiliation. I stood up, my joints cracking softly. I walked to the table, carefully stepping around the broken glass. I didn't pick up the $20 bill. It had no power over me anymore. It belonged to Scott now, a permanent reminder of a lesson he would have to learn on his own. Instead, I placed my hand on the small wooden box. The wood was cool and smooth beneath my fingers. I opened the lid. The brass key sat on its velvet bed, looking so simple, yet holding so much power. The power to rewrite history. I picked up the key, feeling its solid weight in my palm. Then I turned to Mr. Davies. "What now, Mr. Davies?" I asked. "With the company? With all of this?" I gestured vaguely, encompassing the room, the building, and the toxic mess that was Sovereign Trident Capital. Mr. Davies looked at me gravely. "That is the question, isn't it? According to the will, Scott is still the nominal head of the company, but his actual power is neutered. He can't make a major financial move without my approval as executor. And he's stuck with Sovereign Trident," I said, more a statement than a question. "He is," he confirmed. "They'll be in touch soon. They'll want their final payment. Scott will have to face them, alone." A terrible image flashed through my mind. Scott, arrogant and utterly inexperienced in the ways of the criminal underworld, trying to negotiate with true sharks. They would eat him alive. Richard had thrown him into the wolves' den, perhaps in the desperate hope he would learn how to fight his way out. And I was standing just outside the den, holding a loaded gun, the key in my hand. The proof in that safe deposit box might be the only thing that could save him. It could be used as leverage, or turned over to the FBI in exchange for leniency. Richard had given me my freedom, and he had given our son a prison, but he had also given me the key to that prison. Mr. Davies seemed to read my mind. "Richard's will is very clear, Mrs. Miller. The $5 million and the proof are yours. You have no further legal obligation to Miller Properties or to Scott. You can take your money, take your truth, and walk away. No one could blame you." And there it was, the final choice, the choice Richard had left for me. I could walk away. I could go back to my quiet apartment in Sausalito and live out my remaining years in comfort and peace. I could let Scott deal with the consequences of his father's decisions and his own cruelty. It would be justice, a cold, hard, and perfectly deserved justice. Or I could do something else. I looked out the glass wall, down at the city Richard and I had conquered together. I saw our legacy, not just a building, but a complicated history of love, ambition, mistakes, and sacrifice. And I saw Scott, not as the arrogant monster, but as my lost son, a child trapped in the rubble of a world he didn't create. Would I save the son who had broken my heart? Or would I let him drink the poison his own cruelty had helped to mix? I clenched the key in my hand. The cold metal bit into my skin. Richard had left me with the final choice, and that That was perhaps his truest legacy. Not the money, not the company, but the chance to define what it meant to be a mother, a wife, and a survivor. I turned back to Mr. Davies. A decision began to form in my mind, not an easy one, but my own. "Mr. Davies," I said, my voice clear and steady, "I think we have a lot of work to do." 5 years have passed since that day, the day the ghosts of our family were summoned to that top-floor boardroom and the truth was finally given a voice. Sometimes, when I look back, it feels like a strange dream, an elaborate play where we were all unwilling actors, but the consequences were very, very real. I didn't walk away. That was my decision, made in the moment I saw the utter hollowness in my son's eyes. Justice comes in many forms, and I realized that the cruelest punishment isn't always abandonment, but staying and forcing someone to face themselves. We fought. Me, Mr. Davies, and a broken, reluctant Scott. I used the proof Richard left me not as a sword, but as a shield. We went to the federal authorities before Sovereign Trident could come to us. It was a high-stakes gamble. I laid the whole truth on the table. My sacrifice, Richard's cowardice, and Scott's unwitting complicity. The legal battle lasted nearly 2 years. Miller Properties was put under a microscope. We had to sell the Tahoe Villa and the art collection, the personal assets Richard left me to pay the monumental fines. My monetary inheritance all but vanished, but I've never felt richer, because I bought back something far more valuable, a clean slate. Scott paid a price. He avoided prison, but he faced public humiliation as a sanitized version of the story leaked to the press. He was forced to sit through hearings, to answer questions that cut to the bone of our family's wounds. His crown was stripped away. He had to learn to run a company under intense scrutiny, to learn humility the hard way. Our first meeting after that fateful day was about a week later in Mr. Davies's smaller, more intimate office. He came alone, no Chad, no Tiffany. He wore a simple shirt and slacks, not a power suit. He looked exhausted and a decade older. The dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights. He wouldn't look at me at first. He just stared at the floor, his hands twisting together. He started, his voice cracking, then stopped, as if the words were stuck. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything," I answered softly. He looked up, and for the first time, I saw true brokenness in his eyes. Not rage, not confusion, but a profound ache. "I treated you like garbage," he whispered. "For so many years, and all the while you were—" He trailed off again, shaking his head helplessly. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was more. It was an admission, a raw, painful admission of his own guilt. In that moment, I didn't see a 3-year-old CEO. I saw a lost little boy who had just realized the map he'd used his whole life was a blank sheet of paper. I didn't hug him. It was too soon for that. But I did offer him a glass of water, and as our fingers brushed, a tiny, fragile connection was made, a beginning, and he has changed. It wasn't overnight. It was a slow, grueling process, like a rock being worn down by a relentless current. His shell of arrogance was stripped away, revealing a vulnerable and remorseful man underneath. Our relationship now, it's complicated. There are no gushing hugs or easy apologies. Instead, it's built on weekly phone calls, hesitant questions about my health, and sometimes a shared, understanding silence over the line. Last month, for my birthday, he sent me a small peace rose bush with no card. I understood. The company, Miller Properties, survived. It's smaller, humbler, but it's stronger. It's built on a foundation of honesty now, instead of lies. Scott runs it, not as a king, but as a custodian, a man carrying the weight of his past. As for me, I returned to my garden. I used what was left of my money to buy a small house in Napa Valley, with a plot of land big enough for all the roses I could ever want. I'm not a ghost anymore. I am Susan Miller, a gardener, a mother, a survivor. The old safe deposit key now sits in a box on my desk, not as a weapon, but as a reminder. Through all this, I've learned a few things. I've learned that the truth is like water. You can try to dam it up with lies and silence, but sooner or later, it will find a way through the cracks, or it will gather enough force to break down the walls entirely. Trying to bury the truth isn't protecting your family, it's just postponing the flood. I've realized that forgiveness isn't something you give to someone else, it's a gift you give to yourself. Forgiving Richard for his cowardice freed me from the weight of my own resentment. And beginning to forgive Scott isn't about erasing the pain he caused, but about allowing myself to heal, allowing something new to grow in the barren soil of the past. And the most important lesson, perhaps, is about legacy. For years, I thought our legacy was the skyscraper of glass and steel, the numbers on a balance sheet. I was wrong. Richard's true legacy wasn't the company he left, but his final, desperate act of redemption. My true legacy wasn't what I lost, but the choice I made when confronted with the truth. And the legacy we left for Scott wasn't money, but a painful education in the value of honor. In the end, a clean name, a clear conscience, and the ability to look in the mirror without shame that is the only true wealth. It's something that can't be valued in dollars, and it can't be taken away by anyone. That is the garden I tend to every day, in the warm light of the truth. And there, at long last, I have found my peace. Thank you for listening to the whole story. If you are connected with it, please like, share, and subscribe. Also, drop a comment below with your thoughts or your own story. Let's keep the empathy and sharing going.